So we're here with David Lappin and Dara O'Kearney, and the two hosts of the Chip Race. And coming up soon, I guess this Sunday, we're going to see the 10th anniversary. 10 years ago this weekend, Dara just told me. So tell me a little bit about the inception of the Chip Race. How do you two guys meet in the first place?
We have different stories about how we first met.
That's what
I already warned Craig about this because as I told Craig,
we have at least one unreliable narrator here.
Well, no, but both are clearly unreliable. As I told Craig, like with Murray, I'm currently rewatching Mad Men, which we watched several years ago. And we both have the same experience of like, I don't remember that character. Wait a minute, that happens now? I thought that was much later in the show. And if you're like that with a TV show, you can imagine what you're like with your own life. So
it's true.
So everything's a fiction anyway.
Let me hear the two different stories then.
Okay, yeah. You can go first, David.
I think my one is the later one. So I think we were introduced by John O'Crute, a great Northern Irish poker player from about 15 years ago. He probably retired about 7 or 8 years ago, but he was a really good player back in those days. And I knew him online, and Dara knew him both online and in person. And at the Irish Open in 2010, I think, when I first was back in Ireland after I'd lived in the States, we were walking away from the tables at like a 20-minute break, and he said, "Oh, you guys would like each other. You should like hang out. I think you get along." And that was my first recollection of Dara. I think we followed up then in Cork at an event when there was a UK IPT, and that was probably the first time we actually hung out a bit and chatted. But Dara does remember another previous time, which I think paints me in a very bad light. Dara, take it from there.
Yeah, well, basically, I do remember. Well, first of all, I remember just playing in the 45 Bands on Full Tilt, which were both our main game at the time. And I'm not going to lie, I had David Fish tagged for a number of reasons. First of all, his name was in all caps, which is usually a sign of a fish. Secondly, the very first major pot we played against each other, he berated me in the chat box again, normally a sign of a fish. And third of all, when I checked on, I think it was official poker rankings at the time, I didn't look at his 45-man record, which was good, but I didn't know that. I looked at his tournament record, which was not good. He was a fairly significant losing player in normal tournaments over a very small sample, it has to be said. So I just thought, yeah, definite fish. And then I saw that the location was Ireland on it, and since I didn't know him, I was like, yeah, okay, so it's just some random Irish fish. And I remember asking a few other Irish guys about who he was, and they said nobody had a clue. And everybody was like, it must be one of the Dutch lads who moved over for tax reasons. But then anyway, so that was my main memory of him. First of all, that he was this guy who liked berating people in chat. And then we were in the Fitz playing the end of month tournament, and we were in a part of the Fitz that was referred to as the library because there were actual books there, but also it was really, really quiet. For anybody who's never been in the Fitz, which was the main card club in Dublin at the time, it was a converted church, and the library part was where the organ was back in the day. So like it was up above the main floor, and David was being loud and obnoxious and showing off and pretentious and using French words, and I was like, I bet you that's this fishing boy guy. Everything about him it's the same personality type. He was commenting on other people's play. He was doing all this stuff. So I was like, I'm pretty sure that must be him. So yeah, that's my first major memory, David. As we said, as you said, we did get to know each other better, and I do remember hanging out in Cork at the UKIPT.
Yeah, I can't. I honestly don't remember that night, but everything Dara said sounds like me. So I believe
it was you. It was definitely you. Because I remember asking somebody. I said, "This guy has spiky hair." So that was your trademark at the time. Yeah.
So what kind of happened there? Because Dara loves when I turn everything into a homoerotic bromance. What kind of happened from that point onwards is we chatted, and we had lovely chats actually, and realized we both loved Samuel Beckett and similar movies and things like that in Cork. And I invited Dara on what could only be described as a mandate to a nice steak restaurant near the Fitzwilliam Casino some evening, and we sat and ate our steak dinner and had great chats, and a friendship was born.
That's really cool. I mean, Dara, did he ever release? Did you ever take the fish label off
Please,
him?
please finish that sentence, for God's sake.
Did you ever take the fish label off him, or has he still got that moniker?
Oh, I mean, now that I know who he is, I don't need to fish tag him. I mean, I know he's obviously a fish, so no, the fish tag was completely. Yeah, no, I did quickly work out that he was a big winning player in 45 mans, which is why I, believed that he
One of the biggest. It's my only claim to fame in poker.
he might be one of the Dutch lads who'd moved across. Because Irish poker was a fairly small, well-knit community, so when somebody had the Irish flag and you didn't know who they were, you just automatically assumed they were one of the foreign lads who lived here for tax reasons.
Well, how did it evolve into you guys creating the Chip Race? Tell me about the beginning of the Chip Race podcast.
Yeah, well, I guess the relationships kind of like went through a couple of different phases. First of all, like I think in the early days, we quickly discovered we had a good synergy. We had very good characteristics relative to what the other person needed. David basically had no friends. He was a very abrasive character. Everybody hated him. And he tended to get into fights quite a lot.
That part's true. That part is true.
So my main function was to sort of like take the rough edges off him, and people would say, well, like, Carney hangs out with him, so how bad can he really be? And I would also advise him, like, don't pick a fight with that guy. He's former head of the IRA, and don't pick a guy with that fight with that guy. He's like a gangster and so on. So because I knew all
these aren't hypotheticals, by the way. These are actual.
These are actual incidents. Yeah. I do remember at one tournament looking across, and David was having a very heated argument with a guy I knew to be a fairly high up in organized crime. And I was like, well, that's not good. So I told David at the break, like, you're going to have to like tone it down with that guy. It could actually be quite dangerous. And then at the next break, David was like, it's fine. It's all good. He's actually going to give me a lift home afterwards. And I was like, I'm not sure you want to do that. But yeah, but that was kind of my main thing for him. And then on the other hand, one of the problems I had was I was already fairly well known, and kind of everybody wanted to talk to me at breaks. So I wouldn't really get any break. And David was very good at just telling people to fuck off, which he's obviously still very good at, but
hasn't changed.
Yeah. So then I started.
Am I needed here? Can I just go?
No, okay, you can give your side now.
No. I prefer your version.
Talk about how the staking happened, I guess.
I prefer your version anyway.
Go ahead, David.
Okay,
Tell us how
to rush us forward, we staked together for a while. So we had a little stable, kind of a boutique stable, I suppose, because it was only about maybe total 12 or 13 people.
Boutique. We were just staking a few friends. That's what it was.
Yeah, we were. I think maybe 13 people.
Boutique,
fancy word.
Boutique stable.
At any one time,
we sent people money. They played with it. They sent it back if we won. That was it. There was no boutique.
Yeah, kind of basic staking. So we did that for a while together, and then I think we were still maybe just about doing that around this time, or maybe we were.
We were for sure, because if you remember,
towards the end of it, but
2015 was Clean's big year. So
okay, yeah, no, you're quite right. Sorry, we were still doing it for at least another year, and a friend of mine came to me and said, "Oh, are you interested in doing a podcast?" And I was like, "Not really." And
did he have to explain to you what a podcast was?
Probably, yeah. I probably didn't even know what a podcast was. And he basically explained that he was working for, this is my friend Rob, he was working for a company that did like a rugby and a cricket and a horse racing and different podcasts that were kind of sports adjacent. And one of the things they wanted to do, because I think maybe the owner of the company's son played a little bit of poker on the side, they liked the idea of having a poker one. Rob spoke up and said, I actually know, one of the guys who plays poker in Ireland and his friend, and they'd be kind of great for this. So I'll ask them for you. And Rob came to me, and I went to Dara, and we kind of thought it was an interesting idea, but we weren't really like, all in for it or anything. But we went and had a meeting, and it was a nice meeting, and it was in a nice studio, and they clearly had a good setup. So we thought, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's go away for a week and have a brainstorm about what the show would look like, or what it might sound like, or what it might be. And we liked the idea of shining the spotlight on Irish poker, because I guess there wasn't that at the time. So we conjured up this idea of a variety show that would sort of hit different parts of the industry and be in 5 parts, where you had maybe 3 or 4 different interviews over a show. And we went back and they liked us and they said, okay. So we had a sound engineer and a media team and a studio, and it was all very nice. But we had to show up on a Monday morning, which wasn't great because we were poker players. But we kind of dragged ourselves out of bed for 7 weeks in a row and did it. And it was good. Like I listen back and you kind of cringe, obviously, because it's like a really early version of yourself broadcasting. But I guess we at least had enough about us that we thought it had some legs, and maybe enough delusion to think we didn't sound as bad as we did, that we get better. And we made those 7 shows, and our hope was that Paddy Power might sponsor us, who were the big Irish brand at the time. And literally the day the show ended, we found out that Paddy Power had basically decided they didn't care about poker anymore. So that was completely ballsed up. And it was a full year and a half later before we ended up being sponsored by Unibet. And we pitched the idea to them of let's bring back the podcast. And I was very motivated. Dara was locked in. We both had the deals, and that was great.
To be honest, David, I don't think we pitched it to them. I think we had already agreed that we were going to be ambassadors, and they were trying to think of stuff we could do. And I think somebody just Googled us, and they said, "Oh, you used to do this Irish podcast, and it was very popular."
It did go back and forth, but I remember being, whatever way it happened, I remember being very motivated because they had me twitching, and I fucking hated twitching. Yeah. And I thought, if this podcast works, they'll say I don't have to twitch anymore. So I was super motivated.
Yeah, you were. And the other thing I remember about it is originally we were just like, well, we'll just do another podcast and we'll call it the Unibet Show. And then they were like, no, we want to keep the name the Chip Race because you had an existing following. And then, but the reason why the show had ultimately been cancelled was when I came back from Vegas that summer, the company who we were doing it for, and they weren't paying us anything. They were just like, we'll try and get you sponsorship, and then that'll pay for it. But they had literally gone bust. So there was no podcast company anymore. So it was completely defunct. So then Unibet were like, okay, well, we'll go and buy the name the Chip Race from them, and then you can use that name. But then when I think they had some legal issues, and they were like, we can't actually buy the name ourselves, but we want you guys to buy it. And then use it. So we still actually own the Chip Race, like even though it's Unibet sponsored and has always been a Unibet show since it came back. But it was something that we sort of had to. We went to. I can't even. It wasn't a very large amount of money we paid for the name, obviously, but
it was €500.
€500 each. I do remember that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I remember explaining to my wife, we have to pay this €500, and she was like, "What for?" And I was like, "The name of the podcast we used to do." She was like, what? What are you paying money for?
So what were some of the interesting guests that you remember from the very beginning, maybe the most bizarre situations that came up?
I do. Well, the most interesting thing I remember from the first season was we had on one of the guys that we were staking, Kevin Killeen, and Kevin had an amazing year. Basically, he chopped the Irish Open, he won Dublin UK IPT, and he was third in EPT London. So he was obviously a very good guest to get, and the fact that we staked him, we were able to twist his arm. He wasn't that keen, if truth be told. But then we went through the first interview, and it was okay. But then our tech guy told us that there was a tech issue, and we're going to have to do the whole thing again.
Oh no!
And
I forgot.
But the thing which really messed it up was David had kind of conceived that we were going to have this fun segment where we were going to ask him about old poker questions, kind of to show that like the modern new online kids knew nothing about the old guys. That I think that was kind of the theme. So the first time he did it, I think he got 2 out of 20. But then when he did it again, and we had already told him all the answers, surprise, he got all 20 right. So everybody afterwards going like, wow, Kevin really knows his stuff about all those old poker players from the 80s.
Well, so far, so have you had any, besides that, any other tech mishaps that just came out of nowhere that you had? I've had a couple where you just lost everything. Any major tech mishaps?
So it's been an interesting. So I can kind of answer that in a different way. I would say that we were very fortunate in that first season to have a fantastic technician, sound engineer, whatever you call him, in a guy called Collie, who, to be honest, was flawless. Apart from this one glitch in the studio, he did a very good job, and the sound quality was very good. When we came back, we didn't have that luxury of a studio or that setup. And it's fair to say our first few episodes back, sound quality was not good, and it was a bit of a stutter start on our way back from a kind of sound quality point of view. I'm not going to lie, and I won't name names here because that's not the point of this, but I went through quite a few sound engineers. The first sound engineer lasted exactly one show, and then I fired him. The second sound engineer did about 8 shows, and I wasn't happy after about 3, but he made it to 8, and then I fired him. And that was a really awkward one because he's a really nice guy. And I remember David Pomeroy from Unibet meeting me and me saying, I can't work with this guy either. He's not good enough. I'm sorry to say it, but like, he's a really nice fella, and we're going to have to let him go. And he said, you can let him go, but you have to tell him. And I was like, for fuck's sake, like, I don't want to be the one. So I turned to Dara and went, Dara, we have to tell him. And Dara was like, no. He said, you have to tell him.
This is your job.
So it was like putting down a puppy. I had to go and like tell this really nice guy, really lovely fella, genuinely lovely guy, that it just wasn't working out. And he was sort of pleading to, like, oh no, I can do better, I'll please stay. And I was like, I'm sorry, I can't. And then I assume he hates me and has always hated me since that moment. Because we did get another new person, and then that person lasted maybe 2 seasons, and he was actually very good. But while he was being very good for maybe 10 or 12 episodes, I just started learning how to do it myself. Okay. So I became our sound engineer. So I would take responsibility from about maybe the 4th season onwards. It's all me.
You became the sound engineer, but you can barely sign on to this interview.
Yeah, I know, it's remarkable. Like I just would never have expected it. But what it was like David used to write up notes to tell the sound engineer what to do, and it would be like, at 2 minutes 43 seconds, take out the next 2 seconds, and then at 3 minutes 4 seconds, take out between these 2 words, and then after a very ridiculously long time, he did kind of figure out, wait a minute, it'd be just easier if I just did this myself.
Yeah.
So he went off and learned how to do it himself.
So what were like? What's the best? Because it's like a highlight show. It's like watching Johnny Carson over the 30 years. Like, you had so many amazing moments, so many amazing guests, besides myself, of course, but and Andrew Lichtenberger on the same show. What's the best ever podcast moment that you think you both can? Maybe you both have 2 different memories, 2 different takes on that. You have a best moment ever?
There's a couple of ones for me. When we came back after 18 months, having just done 1 season of what was an Ireland only facing show, Unibet came to us and said, like, yeah, we want you to do it, but it can't be Ireland only facing. It has to be more global. And in fact, we want you to downplay the whole Irish thing, because we don't even have a license in Ireland. What they were doing, hiring 2 Irish ambassadors when they weren't even operating in Ireland, who knows? But I think they only figured this out afterwards. So we had to get international guests, and that's a lot more difficult than it looks, because when people look at a podcast, when you ask them to come on a podcast, the first thing they do is look at who's already been on. And if it's a bunch of Irish people they've never heard of, they're like, well, why would I go on that show? So we were kind of leaning on our friends. And actually, in the first few shows back, we were just leaning on the other Unibet ambassadors. And the first person up was Ian Simpson.
Oh, yeah.
But David came up with a genius idea. It was like, well, nobody's going to be that interested in listening to Ian Simpson. Like, how interesting is Ian? So the best way to do this is we'll make it a really hostile interview. We will. So we'll start with a normal interview, kind of lull him in, lull him into a false sense of security. Oh, this is just me chatting with the lads, with my new colleagues. And then halfway through, just the tone immediately shifts, and we just start relentlessly taking the piss out of him, asking him very difficult questions, making him very, very uncomfortable. We got permission from Unibet to do this, as I remember, in advance, because he was a Unibet ambassador, and we were like, we're kind of just going to rip him asunder, but it'll be more interesting than if we just do a regular interview, and it will get people talking and get people listening to the show. And they thought it was a great idea, but they insisted that they actually be there for the recording too, because they wanted to witness it in real time. So you can actually hear them in the background laughing. during the Ian Simpson interview when suddenly the tone changes, because they all knew it was coming, and obviously Ian was the only poor puppy in the room who didn't know it was coming. So that was a personal highlight for me, just seeing us just complete Ian disintegrate into a puddle in front of our eyes. But I guess the real highlight for me will be when we got Jennifer Tilley on the show, because that, first of all, she gave us an amazing interview. She took time out of her busy schedule. She was originally, it was supposed to happen in Vegas, because I had known Jennifer for a few years, from when we were both writing for Card Player, and I asked her if she'd come on, and she said, much to my surprise, she said yeah, but she said it has to be done in person, because we never met in person, and so I said, okay, we'll do it during the WSOP. That year, unfortunately, her mother was ill and she had to leave the WSOP early, so it didn't happen. But she was still insistent it had to happen in person. So we arranged, she was in London promoting her latest Chucky film. And she was doing basically a day of interviews in a hotel room in London. And she said, I can get you guys on the list and just come along and do the interview. And she was such a trooper, because when the film company found out who we were, they were like, they're not going on the list. There's some random poker podcast that doesn't have that much of a listenership. So she ended up doing it in her lunch hour, and giving us the whole hour as well. And she also delivered the most amazing, still my favorite line of all time. She was talking about playing, and we were chatting about what it was like playing tournaments. She had no idea who David was, clearly. So she turned to him at one stage and she goes, "Oh, do you play poker too, David?" Which kind of became a running joke in the show. We got
still is.
Yeah, it still is to this day. Very much so.
Yeah.
How about you, David? Favorite guest?
Look, a bit like what you said at the top, it is very hard, because I guess we've done 400, 500 interviews at this point, and there have been so many great ones from not obvious sources too. Like, we've had some great big name guests, Jason Coons, and people of that sort of like stature. We had a bizarre interview with Jungle Man, which was brilliant, but also genuinely bizarre. We had interviews with, like, Dan Smith's interview, Ike's interview, Steve O'Dwyer, who does very few interviews, came on the show. Obviously, Scott Seavers on the new show coming out in a couple of days, and he was absolutely brilliant as well. Annette O'Carroll, who was maybe the star of our 100th episode, even though we got Doug Polk for our 100th episode. Her interview was absolutely brilliant, and she's back for our celebratory 10th anniversary show as well, which is great, and gave an amazing sort of interview about poker down the years, I suppose, and sort of her wisdom and perspective from the point of view of an older Irish lady who's been in poker for 4 decades, and all she's seen, and the way the game has changed. Because Ireland is incredible for poker, really. Like, after America, it's the first country that really adopted No Limit Hold'em, and probably was playing most of the other variations before anyone else. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge tradition there, and she sort of witnessed it all. We had Donncha O'D, who's another Irish legend, who gave a similarly brilliant interview, looking back through all that time. So yeah, it's very hard to pick a favorite, but there are so many great ones, and also so many that are not from obvious sources. People like Tom Hall, Kat Arnsby are sort of regular returning guests. I'd say they've been probably back once a year, every year. And the reason we love them is because another part of the show that Dara and I are very proud of is, we fire our shots and we call it like we think it is. And even though we're obviously affiliated with Unibet, we've been given this independence from them. They don't really oversee what we do. They trust us to sort of put out a show that they think they're happy to have their name on. And we've been very lucky to have that lack of intervention from them, that we've been free to do what we wanted. And part and parcel of that is saying what we really think about poker. And people like Kat and Tom are also those kinds of people who will say it very plain spokenly what their views are. And I think that's a maybe in some sense at least an equal part to the strategy side that Dara takes the lead on, to the high stakes guys or online guys that people love to hear about. Right. I think that opinion guest is up there with those people for engaging people and making them think about what their views are on things. And I think that's been a big ingredient of the show.
No, it's exciting. Do you have a most embarrassing moment? Did either of you have that happen on the show, for either of you? Dave Wood said, "Ask Darren and David if they have a most embarrassing moment."
We're not easily embarrassed people. I think there are lots of things have happened both on the lock-in and on the show that normal people will be embarrassed by. But Dara and I are, when we get caught by videoing each other lying in the bed together watching the GPI awards, and people are like, "Are they actually in a double bed in a hotel room in Dublin?" And we're like, "Yeah, because we're too cheap to buy 2 rooms. What's the big deal? We're poker players." And people find that utterly bizarre, but we are sort of Morecambe and Wise or Bert and Ernie in some sense, and I guess don't really kind of think about how that looks weird to some people.
It's all good. So as far as we're both of you are both very good writers. Digress for just a second, and we'll get back to some of what's going on the 10th anniversary. Both of you, and David's one of my favorite writers, and Dara's up there, but David's one of them because of his sense of humor. I love to read David's stuff. So where were both you all writing at the time, or did that come about during this time period, the last 10 years? As far as getting the opportunity to have a platform to share your views, and obviously Dara being such a great strategy teacher and coach, in his book series, how did that all come about?
Well, if I could jump in first on this, because I'm really keen to hear what Dara says, but you've always said you like my writing, and I really appreciate that, Craig. But Dara is my favorite writer in poker because while obviously he writes the strategy books with Barry and they're, right up there with the best material that people can find on the internet for, improving their game, there's an emotional quality to a number of Dara's blogs or articles down the years when he decides he's going to do a story of that type where it's going to be maybe anecdotal or personal. I don't know if there's anyone better for telling that story. So yes, sure, sometimes, and everyone who writes in poker is guilty of this, sometimes you're just doing a kind of trip report of the thing you just were at, and maybe that's not the most amazing article in the world. But when Dara gets his teeth into something of that nature, I don't know anyone better, and they're the articles I can't wait to read. And he has so many great stories of that nature. So while I think I probably have certain strings to my bow where people like maybe the opinion stuff, or maybe sometimes there's a turn of phrase I can have in an article that people like how it sounds.
Right.
I'm actually very jealous of what Dara can do with a pen and paper, if you like.
Well, I know to before I let Dara go, I have to admit, now you reminded me, I have read Dara's blog and some of the work he did in the past, and especially his David Bowie story, which is pretty amazing, his relationship with David Bowie. So yeah, talk a bit about your involvement with your writing, Dara, and then into strategy.
Yeah, I mean, basically, back when I was a runner, I had a sort of a diary I kept online, which was really just to tell my coach what I was up to on a day-to-day basis. But it got very popular with other runners as well. And then when I came into poker, it just seemed natural to do the same thing as well. So I started my own blog. It was really just meant as a sort of a dear diary. In the early days, I didn't think anybody else was reading it, and then quickly realized people were reading it because they were coming up and saying, "You called me a fish on your blog. Let's go outside." So I realized people are actually reading me, so I'm going to have to start writing with that in mind. So if you read my very early blogs, they're very unfiltered, and they are clearly just me like venting or talking about what I'm doing. But then there comes a point where I start to realize other people are reading this, and it becomes more sort of self-aware, and I put more effort into it. So I always had that blog. The blog was very, very popular. I think it was last year it passed 1 million views lifetime. Now, in recent years, most of my writing has gone up elsewhere. The strategy stuff goes up on Poker Strategy. I also do some stuff for Type Poker and also Vegas Slots Online alongside David. So the blog has kind of fallen into disuse, but the blog was the main point. And funnily enough, like all the pieces that people like the most from that have nothing to do with poker. There's one I wrote about running. There's one I wrote about my autistic son and the challenges we faced with him. And there's the one about David Bowie, which people rave about. So that and then the strategy writing that came with Barry. That came about 2018, I think it was. He contacted me saying he'd written this piece on poker books that should be written but never were, and one of them was a strategy book on satellites, and he'd asked around and by universal acclaim, I was supposedly the best satellite player in the world at the time. So would I do the book with him? So that's kind of how that started. The relationship with Barry is very good. He's very easy to work with. Similar to David, like he just takes up the slack. You don't have to tell him to do anything. He just works it out himself. Real self-starter. Doesn't mind doing all the boring stuff like uploading stuff onto Amazon and all the other stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So yeah, I guess to be honest, like I definitely don't put the same effort into the non-strategy writing as I used to. There was a time where I was kind of like conscious I was one of the most read blogs in the world and I wanted to keep that going. So I was putting a lot of thought into it. Now it's just, whatever's in my mind, I'm happy to jot off a piece. But I think, David's writing is incredible and has really come on in recent years. And he's just a very skilled technical writer. And I think people can recognize that in the poker space where maybe there's not a lot of very skilled technical writing in general. And also, he's very good at arguing as well, as anybody who knows him knows. So when he does an opinion piece, it's always going to be very well argued.
Right. And David Woods, I blame him for this question. He said, do you guys feel a little bit jealous of being overshadowed by Barry's new fame?
Well, personally, I think he's just been that hilarious person for us as long as we've known him. And I suppose in the last few years, he's sort of decided to be more unfiltered online and share that version of himself with the world. And I guess everyone has realized he's hilarious. Certainly no, I couldn't have been rooting harder for him to win that Twitter thing, even though it's obviously an absolutely nonsense prize. I know he put a lot of stock, maybe stock's not the right word, but he put a lot of effort into his Twitter game, and he clearly had the best Twitter game of anyone last year. And fair play to him. No. Like, I think Barry, deserves everything he gets, to be honest.
Well, Barry's wonderful. I've always teased him about being the small print under Dara's big name.
Which was his idea, by the way. People think I'm some sort of megalomaniac that I insist on his name be smaller, but it was his idea from the start. He was like, "Yeah, but it's your name is the one that's selling this book. We don't actually want people to realize there's another person involved." And I was like, "Yeah, but your name has to go on the cover, like the way we've worked." And he was like, "Okay, well, put it on in tiny letters." It became a kind of a joke then that as his fame got bigger, the font size got bigger. But yeah, like David said, like he's always been hilarious, very easy to work with. Funnily enough, like he's not that actually funny in person. He's very funny in the written form, but you wouldn't meet him and think, wow, this guy's absolutely hilarious. He's quite nervous and socially awkward and shy in person. But he really lets out the full, he's basically a frustrated comedian or a guy who wanted to be a comedian, but his career trajectory took him another way. But when it comes to, being funny on the internet in the poker space, nobody better.
No, he's very talented. A couple more things. Apart from the Chip Race podcast, what do you both, maybe separate answers, what do you both think the poker world is in most need of right now?
I'm going to have a very controversial answer, so maybe Dara should go first.
I know you will.
I
obviously saw, TJ did a whole symposium with Matt Savage about what happened recently of that third place finisher reading the hand not being read correctly at the end.
Yeah.
You and Matt and David wrote about it. I did also. So, but beyond that, what is the one thing you think the poker world is most in need of right now?
Yeah, I think the online space is very messy at the moment between the varying degrees of respectable operators, let's say. At the very top, you have the sites like Unibet that are completely clean, following all the regulation and actually suffering somewhat at the marketplace by not being able to operate in certain countries that other countries are operating in, but by sticking strictly to the law, they are providing a safe environment where, they're never going to be the next Full Tilt. That's just not going to happen. They're not the only site in that category, obviously. But then there are other sites that are more what I would say gray area. They're clearly operating in countries where they shouldn't be operating. They're allowing use of VPNs. And that's the kind of thing which will eventually, potentially, attract the attention of regulators in the same way the Full Tilt did. And then there's all of the apps, and the apps also come in varying degrees of legality. Some of them are clearly breaking all sorts of laws, and other ones are operating closer to legitimate, but still not fully legitimate. And I do think, it's been almost 15 years now since Black Friday, but I feel like there's another one coming, and it'll be a real shock to a lot of people. A lot of people don't realize that their money is not safe. A friend told them, "Oh, you should download this app. We have a club there, and all our friends are playing, and it's very soft and great, and you can," and they get on it. And a lot of them, I have a lot of sympathy for people who live in countries whose governments have taken a nanny state approach of you can't play online poker at all. I'm completely sympathetic to the idea that sites catering to those are a good thing, but when they're also operating in countries where poker is legal, but like if you're living in Ireland, you can play on any site you want, but still lots of people are playing on these dodgy sites. And it's going to be a huge shock to them if any of them ever goes down. And they will, inevitably. At least one of them's going to fail. And people are going to be like, I didn't realize I could lose my money. But, and I don't think we're aware of that. It feels like Black Friday was too long ago and people have completely forgotten about it. But, history repeats itself. And I think it will repeat itself soon.
So the quick follow-up before I grab David, what do you think about the crypto sites like Phenom and CoinPoker?
Again, if they were just operating crypto as that was, to save payment processing fees, or fine, that would be fine. But I think in a lot of cases, it's going hand in hand with it's a way around other regulations. One site in particular openly advertises the fact that they don't do KYC. Now they are basically saying we are breaking the law here. We're not going to put you through this KYC, which we know you all hate, and we do all hate it. It's a pain in the ass to be constantly asked to send documents to sites. But if you're operating in a country where that's a requirement and your site isn't doing that, then they're breaking the law.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Dara. David, so what do you think the poker world is in need of most?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's another subject. I think Dara's hit the nail on the head. I feel like there was a time where I wished that the operators who operate in grey, unregulated territory, who willfully allow or even via agents encourage VPN use for American customers, for people in France and Spain who are not in the ring-fenced place that they should be. The use of the agent system is rampant now and is actually just total cancer to our industry and the way that model has been set up. And I think, of course, you could look at the history of it and you can look at an almost prohibition style aftermath to Black Friday and say, well, it was the breeding ground for why these criminal and pseudo criminal and grey sort of criminal behaviors were able to take place. And of course, you could have huge amounts of sympathy, maybe even for the operators, like definitely for the players who are just trying to find games, but maybe even for the operators who are just trying to fulfill, the desires of those players who are looking for games. And of course, you can stage that argument. And for years, as I saw more and more of our market in poker move into grey and black and unregulated territory, I thought, well, maybe we can come back from this. Maybe, the site that sort of gets a leg up because they've taken an unfair advantage will white label themselves effectively and maybe end up being a good operator and doing things right. And maybe they won't go to, continue to, for example, operate in Russia. Maybe they will stop the agent system dead in its tracks. Maybe they will burn all the affiliates. Maybe they will stop allowing the VPN use by Americans and people who are not supposed to be on those sites fairly, which, remember, is a huge playing disadvantage to the likes of Stars and Unibet and 888 and companies who have played honestly and fairly since that period. I'm aware that obviously Stars' entire growth came from an era where they were breaking UIGA, but they've been very white label in the period since. Maybe other issues at different parts of their history, but certainly white label on that stuff. It's actually got to the point now, and I hate to say this, and this is going to seem like an awful thing to say, maybe, and maybe a very unambassadorial, wrong thing to say for somebody who loves poker as much as I do and cares about the growth of the game as much as I do, genuinely, sincerely in my heart. I think we need a Black Friday. I actually think it's got too far, and I think these operators have run roughshod over laws for too long, that actually the reputational damage that will be caused undoubtedly by a Black Friday type incident in the near future or at some point in the future will actually overall be a good thing, because we need to clean house. There is far too much of our industry which is money laundering, is dodgy Asian, operators using companies, buying companies to rinse money. It's payment processors which are dodgy. It's just all got too dirty, and our game needs a proper cleansing. And it probably has to come from some sort of drastic thing now. It can't come with incremental changes in the reverse direction from where we've got to. I think 70% of our industry is now black or grey. And that's fucking awful. That is an absolute indictment of both what the regulators have, allowed to happen by not enforcing their regulations, what decisions that were made to have nanny states have sort of created breeding grounds for, and also just rogue operators running roughshod. And I genuinely hate to say it, but I think we need a purge at this point.
Okay. Not to name any names, but
I'll name names. I don't give a fuck. I honestly don't give a fuck. You just have to read my articles to see who the names I'm talking about.
I'm not talking. I'm talking about a separate subject.
Okay.
No, I understand. So, and I'm working on something, but
because these fuckers are in our live game too. This could end up impacting massively live poker too. Don't forget.
No, I know. How do you feel? And I just had a great interview with Chris Moneymaker, and Chris pulls no punches. If you work with Chris,
I was impressed by how he spoke. Yeah,
he says things and not caring about the politics of it, and was really sincere, and I really enjoyed our conversation. I've always enjoyed working with Chris. But my point is, as far as ambassadors are concerned, the David Coons, the Haxtons, all these great players who have been ambassadors for sites, including ACR, including PokerStars, Party Poker, what responsibility do they have to raise the standard and not lower the standard? Are they complicit when they find out their site has bots or all this? Do they speak up, or do they say, I quit, I can't stay here? What's their responsibility when they sign on and these things happen? How do you guys feel?
I think it kind of comes down to how much they know. Obviously, when you're an ambassador for a site, you're not an employee. You're not privy to internal communications and all that stuff. So if somebody is operating in good faith as an ambassador for a site, and there's no indication that the site's doing anything wrong, and then it comes out afterwards that the site was doing something wrong, in that case, I would say there's little or no blame on the ambassador. But right. When it's like widely known in the industry that certain sites are doing shady stuff, or that they're not cracking down on RTA, or they're maybe not only not tackling bots but encouraging them or using them themselves, and you then choose to still be an ambassador for that site, then I think you have to take responsibility.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Then I think absolutely you have to take responsibility. And myself and David, we've been very lucky with Unibet, obviously, and people might say, well, yeah, it's easy for you guys to be on your high horse because you've been sponsored all the time by a site which is never going to break any law anywhere. But let's say Unibet decided tomorrow they didn't want to sponsor us anymore. Then for the show to continue, we would have to find a new sponsor. But there are absolutely some people we would not even entertain as sponsors, right, because we would feel that responsibility. We would not want to mislead our listeners into thinking that this site was okay if we thought there was any risk.
That's my point. David, anything to add? About the same?
No, I 100% concur with Dara there. I think he's put it perfectly. I think you don't know what cheaters are able to do. Maybe they can get the wool over the eyes of the security team for the site you're an ambassador. Maybe someday that'll happen at Unibet, and some ring of cheaters will do something to successfully infiltrate games, and then it will be us asking the questions at Unibet, what are you doing to stop it now? What are you doing to fix it now? What are you doing to make sure it doesn't happen again? And if they can't provide good answers for that, then we are going to have to carry water for them in that position. And I would not be willing to do that. I would not be willing. I would be willing to carry water for a site who something bad happened and they're trying to fix it, because of course it's always a game of cat and mouse. And all the sites have my sympathy when they have DDoS attacks, when they have RTA, when they have bots, when they have all the different things that could be happening. When they have, a group of people who are just going to do some colluding and they get together as a group, it's very hard to catch those people maybe. So of course, ghosting is going to be very hard to catch. Of course, you have your sympathies about sites being able to successfully capture those guys and take their money and confiscate and redistribute their money. But they have to try. They have to do everything that they possibly can. And if you're going to be an ambassador for that site, you have to know what that plan is. Maybe you can't know every little minutia of the security measures they're going to take, because that could actually harm their ability to enforce them. But you have to know enough to be able to go out publicly and say, I have confidence in these guys that they're going to try and get this done, that they've figured out what's gone wrong and will fix it. So yes, it's never happened at Unibet. I'm not saying it could never happen. Of course, it's a game of cat and mouse with security teams, but we would definitely, I think Dara and I are on the same page, we would need to see that kind of response if we were going to continue with the site after an event like that.
Well, let's wrap up in a stellar way and talk a bit about what are you excited about the 10th anniversary show that's coming out on Sunday, I believe, right? Can you give us any sneak preview, what you're excited about and your feeling about it all coming up in a couple of days? Because this will come out more than likely the day before the show.
Yeah, well, Scott Seaver was on our wish list for a very long time, and we finally got him for the 10th anniversary, and he gave us an amazing interview. Definitely one of my favorites over the entire show. I kind of expected I would, because I had encountered Scott at the table a few times, and he always struck me as the kind of guy who was very honest and forthright, and also not an egomaniac. So he was likely to give us a very good interview. So I think that was a particularly good interview, and he's going to be the lead guest on the show.
Who else is on the show?
Yeah, to add to that, I guess there was a concept in mind with the show. It's a bumper episode. It's got one extra guest than we would normally do. We wanted the first half of the show to be Irish, as a sort of nod to our Irish roots. 10 years ago, have been, an Irish facing show, and to that aim, we got David Curtis, who is the sort of sponsorship guy now and marketing guy at PokerStars, who's been a friend of ours much longer than we even doing the podcast, a great pal of Dara's and mine, someone we've always bantered with and had fun with, even though we've been on different teams, if you like. But I think very much have a same vision of what poker should look like. We had Danny Maxwell on, somebody who I think I may have asked to come on the show more than any other human being. Danny is obviously a shy guy, a classic shy guy who wants to sort of, do his business quietly, take his photographs without much fuss. But he won the GPI award for Best Photo, having been nominated on 2 previous occasions. He was nominated a third time and finally won, very deservedly. And it seemed like a great moment in time to get him on the show, and he was willing to do so. And then Annette O'Carroll comes back on for more pearls of wisdom. So that first half of the show is lovely. And then for strategy, right after the news, which, by the way, Barry did a great news piece for us as usual. But Tom Hall comes back, I think probably after Cat Arnsby, our most frequent guest on the show. And he seemed like, the right kind of person to have. We wanted to have familiar faces for not just this show, but shows around this period. We'd Cat on a recent show, looking to get Jen Shahade on maybe a show in a couple of episodes' time. People like that who've kind of been on time and time again, and who we love and are great friends of ours as well. So it gives us all the feels and all the sort of nostalgia and all the feeling of like just having been on a journey for all these years with this show and this concept. And I suppose in some ways, and again, classic callback here to the bromance stuff. This is nothing if not a partnership between Dara and I. We've had so many great collaborators: Ian Simpson, Barry, Dara Davey back in the day, loads of people who've helped behind the scenes, Willie Elliott, my partner Sharon. They've provided enormous amounts of support. But obviously the one continuity in the show is Dara and I there on every, segment that isn't the news together. And I think in many ways for people who've gone on that journey and listened to 10 years of shows, or at least dipped in from time to time over that time, we'll have seen a friendship grow, and we'll have seen a relationship and a working relationship and a partnership and a fidelity grow through all that period, which I think becomes maybe at least a subplot in the whole thing.
And Dara, anything to wrap up with?
Yeah, I mean, David has the ability to make everything sound gay, so he's put it up again. But yeah, we do have obviously poker guests, and we never wanted the show to be about us. We have friends who openly admit that the show is about their podcast is about them. Our podcast was never meant to be about us. But when you make as many episodes as we do, people obviously get to know us much better. We're much better known now than we were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were two fairly obscure Irish poker players. And we were genuinely surprised. I think we were walking to the show maybe on the third or fourth one that we were going to do in the first season, and a guy neither of us had ever seen before literally stopped us on the street to tell us how much he enjoyed the show. And that was the first time we ever got a sort of a idea that it had a big impact. And just the way the show has grown down the years, from sort of being just a very niche Irish poker podcast to being something much more general, something apparently in the top 20 comedy podcasts in Germany, which we always get a kick out of. There must not be very many comedy podcasts in Germany. But it's as David said, it's been a very long journey, and it's funny how you remember things. Like when David put up that photo from the first show, I didn't remember that Dan Wilson was there, for example. I was like, what's Dan doing there? I did remember that we had interviewed him in the first season, and actually he gave us maybe the best interview of all in the first season, because he came up with a really great novel concept called Tournament Half-Life, which still stays with me with today. But yeah, I didn't remember that he was there right at the start. But yeah, like so many happy memories from the show. Obviously, at different times it was very challenging. Different times we thought it wouldn't work. When we came back first, the first 3 or 4 shows got less and less and less views than the previous ones, and it just looked like the podcast was fading away. We've obviously had some very public spats with people down the years as well, much bigger names than ourselves, and survived that as well. So yeah, it's been a very positive experience, but there's certainly been enough challenging moments in there.
One thing I'd add as well, if you don't mind, Craig, is just how our sort of philosophy as well was, and we were very true to this all the way through. And actually, I give a shout out to Fintan Hand, who gave me some good advice actually very early on. His Twitch career sort of started around the time our podcast career began. And he said to me, focus on getting a few new audience members every week, a handful each episode, and build it up organically. Don't do the big splashy stuff. That might come anyway, because you might weigh in on something which gets a lot of attention. You might have a guest who'll get you a lot of attention, but focus on the sort of the process of making the shows you want. And therefore people who come back will rely upon it being that product each time, and you'll grow an audience gradually. And I think when you look at the growth of the show, and Dara's absolutely right, we had a successful 7 episodes in a sort of smaller scale Irish context. We came back and it was going down, 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 and we were kind of panicking a little bit at one point, or at least thinking, fuck, if it doesn't turn around soon, we're probably doomed. And we grafted and we stuck to our formula, but we found a few bigger name guests. We researched a bit harder for each interview. We managed to kind of, get out of that nosedive. And very much the pattern of the show has been, we picked up just audience share very incrementally all the time, every episode, to the point that we've reached today now where we are downloaded in 74 different countries. We have an audience like a I won't say a poor episode, because I don't ever call it a poor episode, but like a least popular episode in a batch will still get 17,000 listens, which is a huge number. You think about that, you think that's half a stadium. That's like, you go on stage every night for a quarter of that number. So we've always felt like we've gotten it to this point now where we have so many people from all over the world listening, and we're so proud of that. And we are just grafting away, trusting the sort of formula of the show, but always trying to, find new ways into it. and I think that has served us very well. I know people maybe, especially if they are infrequent listeners of the show, will only remember those spats or those big moments that we've had maybe down the years. But actually, it's much more been a journey of 25 shows a year, sort of 23 of which probably didn't get headlines, but were really good shows.
Right. Well, I appreciate we have David Lappin, Dara O'Kearney, and excited to listen to the 10th anniversary of the Chip Race. Tune in this
It's a banger.
Sunday. Huh?
It's a banger.
Yeah, having literally just said that it doesn't matter when one show, we're all just going for consistency. And if you listen to his last thing, it was basically like, yeah, I think they gave me this great advice of like, don't try and go for big name guests. But then that didn't work. But then we got a few big name guests.
And we got some big names as well.
So there was a real mixed message there, David. But yeah,
you're two big names for my show, so I appreciate you guys coming on board. And everybody, tune in to the Chip Race this Sunday and check out those guys, and it should be a blast. And Scott Seaver is also one of my favorite players over the last 20 years. So enjoy. I appreciate your time, guys. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks a lot, Craig.
Thanks, Craig.